The dust of Dust Haven lived up to its name, coating everything in a fine amber powder that caught the light of the binary suns like ground glass. Marcus Hayes wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of grease that mixed with the ever-present grit. His workshop sat at the edge of the colony, a corrugated metal structure that rattled in the wind and smelled of oil, ozone, and the particular burnt plastic scent of overworked plasma cutters. He was shoulder-deep in the guts of a harvester drone when the sky darkened. The shadow that fell across Dust Haven wasn't the comfortable darkness of clouds. It was the sharp-edged shadow of a ship that cost more than the entire colony's gross product for a decade. Marcus straightened, his spine cracking in 3 places, and watched the Imperial cruiser descend like a predator made of mirrors and spite. The Crystalline Empire didn't visit places like Dust Haven. They didn't need to. Frontier colonies were beneath their notice, useful only for the resources they could extract and the bodies they could conscript when war demanded it. Marcus had seen exactly 1 Imperial ship in his 15 years on this dust ball, and that had been a supply freighter that spent all of 10 minutes on the landing pad before vanishing back into the stars. This was different. This was a warship wearing its Sunday best, all polished surfaces and elegant lines that screamed, "You will never afford to breathe the same air as me." The colonists gathered in the kind of loose, nervous cluster that forms when people don't know whether they're about to be inspected or invaded. Marcus stayed where he was, one hand still resting on the harvester's exposed engine core. Whatever this was, it probably didn't concern. A human mechanic who fixed farming, equipment for trade credits, and the occasional hot meal. The ship's boarding ramp extended with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like a sigh of disdain. First came the guards, tall, imperious figures in armor that seemed grown rather than forged, their translucent crystalline skin visible through the gaps in their plating. They moved with the fluid precision of people who had never doubted their right to occupy space. Then came Emperor Valerius himself. Marcus had seen images before, of course. Everyone had. The Emperor stood nearly 8 feet tall, his crystalline skin refracting light into dancing rainbows across his armor. The crystalline people measured worth in height, in the way light moved through their bodies, in the clarity of their cellular structure. Valerius was perfection by every measure his culture valued, towering, radiant, commanding. Behind him, nearly invisible in his shadow, came someone else. She was so small that at first Marcus thought she might be a child. But as she stepped into the direct sunlight, he could see the adult proportions, the dignified set of her shoulders, the careful way she held herself as if apologizing for existing. Her skin had the same translucent quality as the Emperor's, but where his blazed with refracted light. Hers seemed softer, like moonlight on water. Silver and subtle and somehow sad. She stood perhaps 4 feet tall, maybe less. By human standards, she would have been petite. By her own people's standards, based on the way the guards refused to look at her and the Emperor's rigid posture as he walked ahead without acknowledging her presence, she was something far worse than small. She was insufficient. Mechanic. The Emperor's voice carried across the landing pad like a judgment. Marcus Hayes. You are the human who maintains equipment for this settlement. It wasn't a question. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag that made them marginally dirtier and walked forward, trying not to feel like a child approaching the principal's office. That's right. What can I do for the Empire? Valerius's expression didn't change. It was the kind of face that had forgotten how to do anything as undignified as emotion. I am told you are adequate at your function. You will accept a new apprentice. He gestured behind him without looking, and the small figure flinched. This is Seraphina. She is of my blood, though she brings no honor to it. The words were delivered with the same flat affect he might have used to describe a broken piece of equipment. Her stature marks her as deficient. The Crystal Court has deemed her unsuitable for any position of significance. She will work with her hands since her body fails to inspire with its presence. Seraphina's eyes, silver as starlight, fixed on the ground. Her fingers trembled before she clasped them together to still the movement. Marcus felt something hot and uncomfortable unfurl in his chest. Your Majesty, I work alone. I don't really have the facilities to. I am not requesting, mechanic. Valerius's tone dropped several degrees into absolute zero. The Empire is generous. We provide suitable occupation for all our citizens, regardless of their limitations. You will accept this placement, and you will report on her progress. If she proves completely without use, we will determine alternate arrangements. The way he said alternate arrangements made Marcus's skin crawl. For the first time, Serafina looked up. Her gaze met Marcus's for just a moment, long enough for him to see the intelligence burning there, the carefully banked anger, the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had spent their entire life being measured and found wanting. "I won't be trouble," she said softly. Her voice had a musical quality, like wind chimes made of glass. "I learned quickly. I can be useful." She was already apologizing for existing, already making herself smaller to fit into a world that had told her she would never be enough. Marcus had spent years on Dusthaven learning to mind his own business. You didn't survive on the frontier by taking on other people's problems. The smart play was to accept the Emperor's gift, let the small alien woman work in the back of the shop where nobody would see her, and collect whatever credits the Empire offered for the inconvenience. The smart play was to keep his head down and his mouth shut. "She can stay," Marcus heard himself say. "There's a storage room in the back with a cot. It's not fancy, but it's clean and it's private. She'll need tools, her own set, properly sized, and I expect you to leave her the hell alone unless she asks for you." The last sentence came out harder than he'd intended. Several of the guards shifted, hands moving toward weapons. The colonists behind him sucked in a collective breath. Valeria stared down at Marcus with eyes like cut diamonds. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind pushing dust across the landing pad and the distant hum of the Imperial ship's engines. Then the Emperor smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. How entertaining. The human has opinions about Imperial affairs. He turned to go, then paused. "Do try to make her moderately competent mechanic. It would be unfortunate if my generosity were wasted on complete failure." He swept back toward his ship, guards falling in around him like pieces of an elaborate puzzle. The boarding ramp retracted with that same disdainful hiss, and within minutes the cruiser was lifting off, its engines scattering dust across the colony in a final gesture of contempt. Marcus and Serafina stood alone on the landing pad as the ship became a bright point in the sky, then vanished entirely. "He's not coming back for you," Marcus said quietly. "I know." Her voice was steady, but her hands were still trembling. "He never intended to." "Right. Well." Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly aware that he'd just accepted responsibility for an Imperial princess that her own father had discarded like broken machinery. "Storage rooms this way. It really does smell like metal and rain, by the way. I wasn't exaggerating about that. Mr. Hayes, Marcus, just Marcus. Marcus." She tried the name carefully as if testing its weight. "Thank you for standing up to him." "You didn't have to do that." He looked down at her, way down, because she barely came up to his chest, and saw that her eyes were bright with unshed tears she refused to let fall. "Yeah. Well," Marcus said, because he'd never been good with emotional moments, and wasn't about to start now. "Welcome to Dusthaven, Princess. Let's see if you're any good with a wrench." The storage room was exactly what Marcus had promised, cramped, cluttered, and permeated with the smell of machine oil and ozone. But it had a window that looked out over the amber plains, and when Serafina ran her fingers along the metal walls, they hummed softly under her touch as if greeting an old friend. "It's perfect," she said, setting down the single small pack she'd been allowed to bring. Marcus leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You don't have to lie to make me feel better. It's a storage closet with delusions of grandeur." "No, really." She pressed both palms flat against the wall, and her silver skin seemed to glow slightly brighter. "The metal is content here. It feels settled, like it's been listening to good conversations for a long time." Marcus blinked. "The metal is content." "Yes." She said it as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Can't you feel it? The way it resonates with a certain frequency. It's been well maintained, respected. Metal remembers that kind of care." He opened his mouth to tell her that metal didn't remember anything, that it was just alloy and atoms, that feelings and machines didn't mix. But something about the absolute certainty in her expression stopped him. "Right," he said instead. "Well, get some rest. We start early tomorrow. Sunrise comes fast with binary suns." She nodded, already turning back to examine the room with an expression of quiet wonder that made Marcus's chest ache in a way he didn't want to examine too closely. The next morning, Marcus found her already in the workshop, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside a disassembled atmospheric processor that had been giving him grief for 3 weeks. The component parts were spread around her in a pattern that looked almost ceremonial, and she was humming, a sound so low he felt it in his bones rather than heard it with his ears. "That thing's busted," Marcus said, setting down 2 cups of coffee. "Cooling matrix is shot. I'm waiting on replacement parts from the supply run next month." Serafina didn't look up. Her fingers hovered over the processor's core, not quite touching. "It's not broken. It's confused. It's a machine. Machines don't get confused. Of course they do." Now she did look at him, and there was patience in her expression, the kind reserved for explaining obvious truths to small children. Everything that processes information can become confused. The matrix isn't damaged. It's trying to compensate for a calibration error 3 components upstream. The whole system is working too hard, trying to correct for something that doesn't need correction. Marcus set the coffee down and knelt beside her. "Show me." Her hands moved with absolute precision, finding connections he'd never noticed, adjusting tolerances by fractions of a millimeter. She hummed that deep note again, and he swore, actually swore, that the processor hummed back. "There," Serafina said softly. "Feel that?" He did. The subtle shift in vibration, the way the whole assembly seemed to relax into proper alignment. When she activated it, the processor ran so smoothly it barely made a sound. Marcus stared at the device, then at her, then back at the device. "How did you—" I listened. She wrapped her arms around her knees, making herself small again. "It's what I do. What I've always done. In the palace, I wasn't allowed in the throne rooms or the grand halls, but nobody paid attention to where I went otherwise. So I spent time in the maintenance levels, with the environmental systems and power cores. The machines talked to me. Or I talked to them. It's hard to explain the difference. That's impossible. I know what your science says." Her voice was gentle, not argumentative. "But your science also said that human and crystalline neural patterns were too different to allow for any meaningful communication, and yet here we are, talking. Sometimes reality is more creative than theory." Marcus picked up his coffee, realized. His hands were shaking slightly and set it back down. "How long have you been able to do this?" "Always, I think. But I only started really understanding it about 5 cycles ago." She touched the processor again, and it purred under her fingers. "My father's chief engineer caught me in the auxiliary power station once. I was 12. I'd fixed a cascade failure that would have shut down an entire wing of the palace. He reported me to the court. Why would— That's a good thing, isn't it?" Serafina's laugh was bitter crystal, beautiful and sharp enough to cut. "You'd think, but in the Crystalline Empire, especially in the royal family, everyone has their place. Their role. I was already an embarrassment because of my height. The last thing my father needed was for me to develop abilities that none of his advisors could explain or control. The chief engineer suggested that I was communing with machines in unnatural ways, that I might be corrupted by artificial intelligence, that I was a security risk. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Stupid doesn't matter when you're trying to maintain order in a court that measures everything by strict hierarchies." She stood, brushing dust from her simple gray clothing. "So they forbade me from working with technology, posted guards to make sure I stayed in the appropriate areas, and every day I could feel the machines around me, confused and struggling, and I couldn't help them. It was like being deaf to music that everyone else refused to acknowledge existed." Marcus stood too, and for the first time really looked at her, not as a burden dumped on him by an emperor's contempt, but as a person who'd had a gift and been punished for it. "That's why he sent you here, not because you're deficient, because you scared him. Maybe." Serafina walked to the workbench where a dozen half-repaired devices waited in various states of disassembly. Or maybe he was just tired of looking at his failure. "Either way, I'm here now, and if it's all the same to you, I'd like to actually use what I can do. I've wasted enough time already." Before Marcus could respond, the workshop door slammed open. Governor Blackwood strode in with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from being the largest fish in a very small pond. He was a thick man, red-faced from the heat, with calculating eyes that were already assessing everything in the room as potential leverage. Hayes. Heard the Emperor dumped his defective daughter on you. Blackwood's gaze slid over Serafina with unconcealed contempt. How much did he pay you to take her off his hands? Nothing, Marcus said flatly. And she's not defective. No? Small thing like that? Blackwood laughed, a sound like gravel in a garbage disposal. Well, maybe she'll be useful for something. I've got a project needs someone with delicate hands. We're not interested. I wasn't asking, Hayes. Blackwood's voice dropped into threat territory. I've got an experimental terraforming device that needs assembly. Been sitting in pieces for months because the technicians from the core world say it's too dangerous to work on. But if the Imperial Princess is so talented, he smiled, showing too many teeth. Well, she can prove her worth to the colony. Publicly. Tomorrow at noon in the Central Square. Unless you think she's really as useless as her father claims. It was a trap, elegantly laid. Refuse, and Serafina would be branded as worthless, confirmation of every insult the Empire had thrown at her. Accept, and she'd be forced to work on a device that had already been declared too dangerous by qualified professionals. Marcus felt the anger rising in his chest, hot and righteous. She's not performing for you like some... I'll do it. Serafina's voice cut through his objection, calm and clear. Tomorrow at noon, I'll assemble your device, Governor. But when I succeed, you'll acknowledge that my father was wrong about me. Publicly. In front of the entire colony, Blackwood's smile widened. And when you fail? Then you can report back to the Empire that you were right all along. That I'm exactly as useless as they believed. She tilted her chin up, and despite her small stature, she suddenly seemed to fill the room. Do we have an agreement? Serafina, no, Marcus started. We have an agreement, Princess. Blackwood sketched a mocking bow. Noon tomorrow. Don't be late. He swept out, leaving the smell of expensive cologne and cheaper ambition in his wake. Marcus rounded on Serafina. What were you thinking? You don't have to prove anything to these people, especially not that. Yes, I do. Her hands were fists at her sides, trembling slightly. I spent my entire life being told I was insufficient, being hidden away, being treated like a mistake that everyone was too polite to correct. I'm done with that, Marcus. If I fail tomorrow, at least I'll have tried. At least I'll have chosen. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that Blackwood was dangerous, that the colony's opinion didn't matter, that she was enough exactly as she was. But the look in her eyes stopped him. The desperate need to finally prove that she had value beyond the measurements that had defined and dismissed her. Okay, Marcus said quietly. Then we'd better get to work, because you're not facing this alone, Princess. Whatever Blackwood's dragging out tomorrow, we're going to figure it out together. For the first time since she'd arrived, Serafina smiled. Really smiled. Not the careful, pleasant expression she wore like armor, but something genuine and bright and heartbreakingly hopeful. Together, she repeated, testing the word. I think I like that. They worked through the night, Marcus teaching her the specific quirks of human engineering while she showed him how to feel the resonances in metal, the way components wanted to fit together if you stopped forcing them and started listening. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, exhausted and running on coffee and stubbornness,